Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're taking an incredibly visceral journey through the 70-year struggle of school integration. We are going to step totally out of the courtroom and look at this history directly through the eyes of the students who actually lived it. So what really happens when the Supreme Court outlaws a way of life, but the nation absolutely refuses to listen? Well, let's dive right in and explore this massive gap between a constitutional ideal and actual enforced change. I mean, it's one thing to strike down a law on paper, right? But it is an entirely different battle to change the reality of a student just trying to walk to school the next morning.
Section 1. The Promise to Linda Brown, a commute that changed history.
Imagine waking up and facing this daily reality. Under the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson doctrine of separate but equal, a young girl named Linda Brown had to endure a grueling commute. She was flat out denied admission to her local elementary school simply because of the color of her skin. Instead, she was forced to travel to a distant, inferior black alternative, even though a well-funded, superior, all-white school was located miles closer to her very own front door. And this quote from Chief Justice Earl Warren really hits the nail on the head. It perfectly captures the psychological evidence presented by Dr. Kenneth Clark. You see, Dr. Clark used dolls to demonstrate how segregation forced black children to perceive themselves as inferior. It was this exact heartbreaking evidence that convinced unanimous Supreme Court in 1954 that educational segregation stamped an inherent badge of inferiority on black students, making the practice officially unconstitutional.
Section 2. Schools as American Symbols, a tutorial on community values.
Now, you might be wondering, why was the resistance to integration so explosive? Well, to understand that, we have to recognize that schools are not just brick-and-mortar buildings. They are powerful reflections of a community's deepest values. For the white community, segregated schools were seen as symbols of academic pride and, frankly, privilege. But for the African-American community, integrating them symbolized hope and equal opportunity. So changing a school wasn't just about switching classrooms, it meant completely rewiring the social fabric of a city.
Which brings us to Section 3, Little Rock and Federal Power, the 1957 Crisis.
Just take a look at the sheer architectural grandeur of Little Rock Central High. It was actually dubbed the most beautiful high school in America, and it heavily represented white community pride. But practically overnight, this symbol of excellence became the ultimate test case for federal civil rights enforcement when 9 brave African-American students simply attempted to enroll. And we can really ground this massive abstract legal battle in everyday physical landmarks. I'm talking about places like the Magnolia Mobile Station or Ponder's Drugstore, right near the high school campus. It was at these exact, completely ordinary locations on South Park Street where segregationist mobs literally gathered. They chanted, they prayed, and they demonstrated, brutally threatening, heckling, and spitting on African-American students who were literally just trying to walk into a classroom. So how does this escalate into a full-blown national crisis? It's kind of a chain reaction. First, we have massive state defiance, with the Arkansas governor actually using the National Guard to bar the students' entry. Second, the international media captured this street violence, dragging America's local racial conflicts right onto the global stage. And finally, this massive escalation compelled President Eisenhower to use unprecedented executive power. He sent in federal troops to uphold the court's integration orders. Think about that. It was the first time since Reconstruction that the military was used to enforce black civil rights. Moving on to Section 4. Resistance and lost black educators. The heavy cost of integration. You see, segregationists didn't just back down. They launched a fierce campaign known as massive resistance. To avoid integrating, some localities literally shut down their entire public school systems. They diverted public funds to vouchers and tuition grants to prop up all white private schools, desperately trying to keep political and educational control over their communities. And here is a truly shocking consequence of all that resistance. 100,000. Between 1952 and the late 1970s, 100,000 black educators were systematically purged, fired, or demoted. Because black citizens were largely barred from Southern universities, a lot of these teachers had traveled all the way north to earn their master's and doctoral degrees. They were exceptionally credentialed. Yet they were fired and replaced by less qualified white segregationists as all black schools were closed in the name of a very, very skewed version of integration. Let's look at Section 5, Court Orders versus Actual Change, the speed limit analogy. Okay, to put this all into perspective, think of it like this simple analogy.
The 1954 Brown decision, well, that posted the speed limit. It declared that segregation was wrong. But because of vague guidelines, like telling states to implement change with all deliberate speed, the South just stalled. It actually wasn't until the 1968 Green decision, which placed an affirmative duty on school boards to genuinely integrate their facilities, faculties, and extracurriculars, that the government essentially started pulling people over for breaking the law.
And you can see the reality of this delay vividly in New Kent County, Virginia, which was the actual battleground for that Green decision. Just look at this stark comparison. Black students at the all-black Watkins School were educated in a building, controlled by an all-white school board, mind you, that lacked a gymnasium and sports fields entirely. Meanwhile, just down the road, the all-white New Kent High was well-funded and vastly superior.
Looking at this timeline, it's like watching a giant puzzle slowly come together. We can clearly trace how the legal struggle over Jim Crow segregation evolved. It started from the deeply flawed separate but equal doctrine of 1896, moved to the abstract constitutional rulings of 1954 and 1955, and finally, over a decade later, arrived at a firm, mandated integration requirement in 1968 that actually changed the daily lives of students.
Finally, we arrive at Section 6, the modern resegregation crisis, 70 years later.
So, fast forward 70 years to today. You'd think everything would be fixed, right? Well, today we see students navigating a completely new, yet hauntingly familiar, educational crisis. The landscape has changed, but the fundamental issues are still right there. Recent Stanford research reveals a startling statistic. Over the past 3 decades, racial and economic segregation in large school districts has actually increased by 70%. While we aren't at pre-Brown levels, the trend line since the late 1980s shows a really steady, significant resegregation of American classrooms.
And researchers make a really crucial point here. This modern resegregation isn't just some passive accident of shifting neighborhood demographics. The data indicates it is actively driven by contemporary policy choices. This modern segregation concentrates poverty, primarily affecting Black and Hispanic students, which inevitably results in vastly unequal learning opportunities. It's almost literally mirroring the systemic inequities of the past.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, it leaves us with a pretty tough question to chew on. Looking at the data in our schools today, have we truly learned the lessons of the past? Or, despite the incredible bravery of Linda Brown and the Little Rock Nine, is the 70-year struggle for educational equality just beginning its next complex chapter? Thank you so much for exploring this history with me.